So for those who don't know me, my name is Carly Richmond. I am a developer advocate at Elastic. That is pretty much a new gig. I only started 3 weeks ago. So before I did that, I actually worked in a large investment bank as a technologist for 10 and a half years. And this talk is based on my experiences while working in that particular institution. So as we build out software, we tend to form opinions on things, don't we? And my opinion that I'm going to talk about today is that in institutions where we have large volumes of data, on the front end side, we often default to showing large data grids filled with endless streams of information, when in reality, it probably might be more appropriate to use an alternative control such as a chart or a smaller section of data. So I'm going today to talk about the reasons why I've observed that this happens. I'm going to talk about the problems that this presents to our users, because it's a very user-focused thing. And also through a series of code samples and screenshots, we will talk about particular charts that you can use based on both user behavior and the structure of your data to try and give an alternative option to how you showcase your data when you're building out apps in the future. Okay, and this is where the clicker doesn't work, but that's fine. Cool. So I just talked about the fact that I worked in an investment bank for 10 and a bit years. And I had an amazing time doing that job because I had the opportunity to wear so many different hats. I had stints as a developer working on not just different types of technologies, but different domains as well. I was a scrum master, I dabbled in agile coaching, I tried people management, I did team and technical leadership. It was really fun. And sometimes I would wear these hats in parallel. I'm just realizing it probably was a bit of a trick I missed not wearing a hat today, but for next time. Anyway, so my favourite hat, the one that I think I suit the best, is that of front-end engineer. And that's because it's just my happy place. I love building out things that people can see, and I like showing a little bit of creative flair along the way as well. Now, I haven't always worked in web. I started off doing desktop UIs, and then about 7 years ago, along with some other colleagues, we started trying to learn web and build out dashboards because there was a demand in the team I was in at that point in time. And that was such a fun time for us. We got to talk to users more to try and find out what they wanted and what they needed. We got to learn new tech along the way. We built our first data grid. Yes, we did start with the data grid. That's where the story starts. And then after that, we started using various charting libraries and visualizations to show off the data. But we were kind of victims of our own success in a way. Because we'd been getting such good feedback from the users and collaborating with them, now everyone wanted to build a dashboard. Everyone wanted to see their data in some pretty format, or in any format at all. And historically, I don't think this is specific to this institution that I used to work at. I've seen it as a general trend in the industry. Generally, we don't have as many front-end dedicated engineers compared to back-end or full stack. So we didn't have enough of the expertise to meet everyone's demands. So what we ended up doing is we had some lovely back-end engineers who decided to learn some shiny new tech and go into this foray of building out front-end controls. We tried to help them in a couple of ways. We built really small wrappers that worked with our existing data services and also with the grids and charts that I talked about to try and just make it a bit easier for them to get up to speed and build something a bit more quickly. But we would also do a lot of mentorship and a lot of guidance to try and impart, I guess, the creative eye. So quite often I would either get on calls or I would sit in front of somebody's computer and they'd be like, Carly, I'd love your feedback on this screen I've been building. And I started to see a very regular pattern. Every single time I was presented with a grid that looked like this. Every screen looked the same. And it wasn't just me in a case of deja vu. So every single time, this screen would always adhere to very common patterns. So the first thing that would always happen is you would have a set of controls to narrow down the selection that was coming back from the server. And normally it was multi-select drop-downs or autocompletes like you can see here, but occasionally I would be surprised by a checkbox or two, which was nice to see. There would always be at least one data grid. Now, I use the word at least one for a reason, because sometimes you would have segments of the screen with one underneath the other, perhaps as a way to separate different categorizations of data. But irrespective, often we were showing large volumes of data, Sometimes between a couple of different screens, they would be at very similar levels of data, sometimes be a big overlap in the columns. And there would always be large volumes of columns, so you're getting your scroll bars involved, and then they would always add pagination and inline filtering to deal with the large volume of rows. And then finally, without fail, there was always a lovely, might not be too clear here, but a lovely export to spreadsheet feature, just in case a user needed it. So with this deja vu, I started asking some questions. And the one that I loved the answer to and I loved discussing the most was this one here. What is the user outcome? You've built a screen here. What are they trying to do? And it's really interesting because I was always looking for an answer that was centered around the process a user was doing. You know, maybe they were doing management reporting, maybe they were reporting on a particular domain within the bank. But I would always get more of a functional answer based on the view I was seeing. Like, oh yeah, Carly, well, they'll come in and they'll select from these drop downs and then they'll scrutinize the data and then they might export it out to have a play with it outside. And then when we dug in later and we go back and ask some questions, what we would end up finding is quite often this data was being translated into another form outside of our application, into pretty management charts, spreadsheets and summaries that could be consumed. And I always wondered, why didn't we automate that bit? And I'm sure now that I've asked that, you're thinking the exact same thing. Now, it would be really easy to judge in this situation and say, well, it's really easy, Carly. They've just got it wrong. They've not automated the right thing. But we shouldn't be so hasty here. There's some very innocent and well-intentioned reasons as to why these kinds of things happen. And that's what we're going to talk about now. So the first reason, sadly, and this one makes me cringe a bit, but it's true, is in these institutions, they love their spreadsheets and their spreadsheet applications. And it's not very difficult to see why. Irrespective of which app we're talking about, some form of spreadsheet application has existed on their desktop for probably decades now. It's there the first day they join, ready to do whichever objective or role they've been hired to do. And they normally have a rich array of analytical capabilities that are easy to understand and easy to get up to speed with quickly. Now, a common law of UX that some of you might have heard of is Jacob's Law. And for those that haven't, it's basically the idea that users anticipate and expect the applications that they use day to day behave and function in very similar ways to the other applications that they use in their daily lives. So a good example of this is if you have a power user of Microsoft Excel, if they suddenly start using Google Sheets tomorrow, they are going to expect to be able to do very similar things and be able to find those things in very similar places. Now, data grids have that same kind of feel if you think about it. They're basically big tables with inline filtering capability, potentially pagination, separation by pages and sheets. And that means that they're a natural choice that we can get the users comfortable with to start coming into our application and trying to get them away from their spreadsheets. The second reason is that time to market pressures often result in us picking the same controls time and time again, because we don't really have the time to go off and try and figure out an alternative. And that was pretty much a pattern that I saw quite a lot. So I talked about that little wrapper that we kind of made this situation partially ourselves because we made it too easy for these engineers to suddenly start building out screens. And even when we started they learned a bit more and they started using the native controls themselves, they were still defaulting to data grids because they knew how to do it and they knew how to get it out quickly. Now, this can be a bit of a problem because although there is an element of copy pasting, unlike the bad smell when you think about building out various different screens, irrespective of whether it's configuration or whether it's an API, if you find a defect or a bug, or if there's a change in the API that means that you need to change and update the configuration of that control, you're leading to a bit of a maintenance nightmare because you're going to have to update every single screen in turn. And that can get, in the case of explosion, which is what we're talking about, to be a little bit of a problem. Now, the third reason is that finding that true user objective that I was asking them about is actually quite a surprisingly difficult thing to do. Now, we quite often have users come with very precise ideas in their head saying, I want this. But sometimes we don't really ask enough questions to try and figure out if that's what they need. We try to people please. And this can be driven from loads of different reasons. So for example, if you work in a domain where, it's not, a technical domain that is driving the key business objectives, having a lack of business knowledge can make it difficult to try and find out what that true outcome is, because you might not be sure what to ask. But it can also be things such as conflicting viewpoints and opinions. It can be just the state of the current process that you're expected to replicate, similar to kind of the idea of Conway's law and organizational structures and processes being replicated in our software systems. But also other simple things like cultural and communication challenges can make it difficult for us to find out what the true outcome should be. Now, the final reason, which is very much highlighted well by this particular cartoon, is that we all have opinions on design that we drag into the products that we build and design, and that's irrespective of team culture, dynamics, and whether you have dedicated design presence or not, because in my 10 years experience, I didn't always have a designer in my team. Sometimes that responsibility defaulted to me a little bit. So some of you, hopefully, will recognize this cartoon, but if you don't, it's from a book by Steve Krug, and the book's called Don't Make Me Think. And it's one of my favorite books in design. It was redone for web a few years ago, but a lot of the points in there are still relevant. And if you read through this cartoon, what you're basically seeing is an active discussion of people talking about particular controls that they hate and saying, we can't use this control, we can't use pull downs because I hate them. And sadly, when we're building out particular applications, all of the opinions of the team get factored into the controls that we build. And that includes not just aversions to controls, but preferences for controls. I have an opinion on design, and that's very obvious because I am standing right in front of you here giving an opinion on design. But every single person here listening to this talk today has an opinion on design, and you pull them into the screens that you're building and that you're using. And you will form them based on experiences. You will form them based on that time that you tried to book a flight or a hotel and you had to enter information and use this really clunky date picker to put in your date, or whatever that bad experience is. You think of that automatically when someone suggests using a similar pattern and go, we cannot do that. But you'll also then follow preferences because you might be a bit scared to try something different. And sadly, in the case of data grids, that's what quite often happens. We keep doing the same thing time and time again because it's comfortable. So I've talked about those 4 key reasons. But why should we care? Does it actually impact our users at all? Well, I have a bit of a theory that it does. I think that overloading them with data by just putting all the data out there just in case they need it can affect their overall focus on the task at hand, their overall ability to concentrate on what they're doing, achieve their objective, but also thinking about data volumes over their overall well-being. Because if we're just giving them all the data because we're not sure what they need, we're kind of subjecting them to information overload. And we all joke about that. We say, oh, it's information overload, it's just not going in whenever we're trying to learn something new, or the endless notifications streaming through our phones. But in some ways, it is becoming a bit of a reality, and we should understand a bit about what this definition actually is and where it comes from. So the original first kind of definition that I could find on information overload comes from a guy called Bertram N. Gross. He wrote a paper in the 1960s called The Managing of Organizations. And then Alvin Toffler, who wrote a book called Future Shock in 1970, then popularized the term when he talked about the impact that technology change can have on society. So the basic textbook definition is that the volume of inputs being processed into a particular component exceeds that component's capacity to process it. So just like any of the apps that we build, any of the websites that we construct that can be overloaded by traffic, nefarious or innocent, the fact of the matter is that we too, as human beings, can be subjected to information overload. And if you put all of the data in front of them and try and get the users to figure it all out, you are contributing to that problem. Now, it's difficult to say for certain if this actually is impacting our ability to focus, because measuring focus and figuring out if it's dwindling or not is actually a very difficult question to answer. I tried to do that from the research for this talk. I read books that would maintain that, factors such as volumes of information, diet, and all sorts of other modern day life factors are impacting our ability to focus. But then I would find other pieces that would say, actually, you can't actually measure the collective focus of humans. It's actually not a possible thing to do. Now, I have resources at the end if anyone's interested in the reading that I did, but irrespective of while we're answering this question, one thing I think of is that whenever I observe my users using my applications, they weren't just using my app, they were using other resources. They were using chat apps on their phones or on their desktops. They were chatting to colleagues. They were looking at policy documents. They were using other applications. Your app isn't the only source of truth, so you need to figure out what volumes you actually need to subject them to and consider the right level for them to do their roles. So how do we solve this problem then? And how can we help everyone that's listening today? So there might be front-end engineers such as myself or designers in the room that are thinking, well, how do I build and design views that are not going to subject my users to information overload? And any back-end engineers are probably thinking, wow, this looks a bit scary delving into front-end. I'm not sure I understand or know what the potential user behaviors and patterns are that I should look for when trying to figure out which control to use. And that's what we're going to talk about now. So you will see a QR code floating about up there. So that links to the code examples that we're going to walk through. Now, don't panic if you haven't caught it. It will appear at the end. But what we're going to do now is we're going to talk about user behaviors, and we're going to talk about particular data constructs that you can use along with particular patterns to try and identify an alternative control to help you feel more comfortable saying, I shouldn't be using a data grid. I will use something else. And that's because we need to come from a more helpful place. You probably looked at the title of this talk and thought, wow, she's going to say that data grids are the most evil construct on the face of the planet. She never wants to see them in any app as long as she lives. And that's not practical, and it's not necessarily true. You just need to use them in the right way. And we will also cover a bit of that as well and some tips that I've found that have worked to try and get the volume down while still using a data grid along with when might be a suitable case. So the first user behavior we're going to talk about is sorting. Now, this is a really common thing that you've probably caught yourself doing, and it's a common thing that I've seen users do as well. It's very natural to want to find the top or the bottom of something, so pushing these extremes to the top of a bottom of a column is a very natural thing to do. And that's because these extremes are actually rather interesting. So if you think about, for example, maybe a product, a customer, a currency, whatever attribute it is, that consistently is featuring in your top rankings for a few months and then it suddenly disappears, you're going to want to know why. Or if you see dips in your data set over a time series, you are also going to want to know why. So I'm going to show you two different chart types, and I will call out the libraries I've used, but of course there are other alternatives, and if I might mention ones that I've used that you can look at as well as we go along. So if your data is based on numerical structures, so maybe it's a count or a balance, you should think about using a bar or a column chart. Obviously, one is a flip of the other. And these are good because you can easily pick out the natural extremes here. So you can see that April was actually a really good month for anvils. I do wonder why, but there we go. So this particular implementation is in Recharts. That is a React charting library. But I'll also show you HighCharts as well, because it also covers some very interesting library differences in terms of how you normally interact with these libraries. And it also gives you, in the case of HighCharts, one that has wrappers for other frameworks as well. So if you're using Vue or Angular or even native JavaScript, you can have a look at HighCharts as well. Okay, so we're going to try and work through the code here. My clicker has gone a bit haywire, but we will see what we can do. So the first thing to point out, if you look here at line number 15, is you need to think about responsiveness when it comes to your particular charts. Some will have this capability out of the box, but Recharts actually has a responsive container that you wrap your chart around. And you might think that this is just a useful thing for dealing with multi-device support, so thinking about desktop and mobile. But I've actually anecdotally had experiences where I was building desktop apps and actually we still needed to think about resizing because the analysts had smaller monitors than the developers. And I only found that out by going to the floor one day, so that was quite interesting. The second thing to know is you're going to be passing in your data. So if you look here at line number 17, at the top, I'm basically passing in a list of objects with each of its individual property names. So just a generic JavaScript object, nothing too exciting. Now, recharts specified everything as HTML elements, and this differs, as you'll see in a minute, from some option-based charting libraries. But one thing that you'll note here is this particular data key element. So this is basically what's corresponding to the object in the data series. So I'm using it, you'll see on line 24, where I'm passing it into the x-axis to denote my categories, but I'm also using it here in the bar. And the final thing you need to think about is actually stacking. Sometimes you quite often just assume that we should have it as stacked just to try and conserve space. But there's other reasons to use stacking and partial stacking modes as well. So what you can see in my particular example is that I've got two different types of rubber bands, and I've wanted to kind of group them together into a categorization. So what I've done is given stack ID of A on those two, and then I've left the anvils to do their thing. And that's why you have those two grouped together compared to an individual series for the anvils. I did promise you a high charts example, and here it is. So the key things that you're going to note that are different is straight away, we don't have HTML elements for the different sections of our charts. It's all passed in via options. The second thing you're going to want to see is that the structure of how we input our axis categories in our series is actually different. So here you will see that the categories on the x-axis is basically passed in as a list. And then for your series, each of the data elements in turn is actually passed in as an array on the appropriate series. So you obviously need to make sure that those are in the same order, otherwise you're not going to be showing the right thing. So that's worth noting. And then obviously thinking about that stacking mode again. So I've just put in normal here as the configuration, but it's a configuration thing on the chart rather than on the particular bar attribute. So date columns you can use bar and column charts for. But obviously, if you've got kind of longer time series or you've got smaller fluctuations that you want to be able to see the difference between, then you should probably be considering using a line or an area chart. And an area chart is normally a good indicator of volume compared to line being in position. So the way I like to think about it, going back to a financial example, is if you think of a stock position, that's probably a good one to have as a line. Meanwhile, if you start talking about trading volumes, an area chart can be a good indicator there. You also should think about whether, in this point with long time series, do I need zoom? Do I need capabilities to allow my users to get into the data very easily? And what you'll see up in this top corner is this little reset zoom button, which is exactly what's enabled here. Now, depending on the library, this is achieved in one or two ways. High charts actually allows you to just do very basic configuration. You specify zoom type and the axes, and you're pretty much done. Meanwhile, with things like recharts, you need to specify the algorithm for the transform. So it's definitely worth thinking about that when you're trying to decide which library to use. So the key things we're going to point out here is you've got to think about your axis here. This is where you normally have to specify that you're using a date time or a time-based axis. So high charts has that here, as you can see with the x-axis type on line number 12. It's important to know that other libraries do this as well. So for example, anyone using elastic charts will have seen that you can specify time as the axis type as well. So it's a common pattern to see. And then you'll see that our data is structured very differently. So if you see on line 21 here, I've got this really, really, really long number. So this is basically your milliseconds since epoch representation of your date coupled with the appropriate value. Now, hiding information is a common thing. It kind of is a normal reaction when we give them tons of data and then just expect them to handle it. They want to try and find the things that's useful. They want to try and, make sure that they're looking at the subset of data that's useful for this particular point in time. And this can manifest in one of two ways. It can either be using the inline filters that pop down on the grid, which they're using to filter particular columns, or it can just be that they're hiding columns altogether. But quite often when I saw users doing this, you would ask if it's just, focusing on part of the task at hand, or if it's a transformation of the data into some other form for consumption in a different format down the line. And that was what was happening if you think back to our story. It was being translated into charts, visualizations, and summary statistics that were to be consumed by managers or other individuals. And in that instance, it's probably the case that you probably want to dig further into that to see if it's something that you can automate. So one good way that I've seen these being represented is actually using something called a summary card. Now, when we often think of summary cards, we think about the kind of modern material design, and we think about, maybe music apps where we have our image and our buttons. But you can use them in other ways. So you'll see here that what I've got is actually a little bit more complex. I've put in a little chart in here, which is a recharts line chart. And then I've got some summary statistics on that appropriate user. And these are good for a couple of reasons, because they serve as good kind of initial insights that you can maybe then, if you want, dig into later. And they're also really good for showcasing repeated attributes. So if you have a portfolio of products that you look after as a sales manager, or if you have a portfolio of stocks, you can see basically your entire portfolio represented in these small summaries. So I've used MUI cards, or MUI cards, depending on your flavor. But you can also use Angular material if you're coming from an Angular background, and that's kind of bundled in there. There is Elastic cards, which I've not played with too much, but that's also there too. And then there's also Materialize, but obviously you'll need to bear in mind that these are all material themed, and that might not work for your app. So definitely have a look to see what component libraries work for your particular case. So we're not going to go into this code in a lot of detail. I just want to point out the key things to help you understand when you're using summary cards, what kind of things you need to look for to get up to speed quickly. So obviously we're going to have a card, that's kind of a given, but you'll see I've got 2 box segments. So they normally give you segments in order to try and cover different parts of the card. So you see I've got that there with 2 boxes. I've also got that there with the card content there. So these are good for enforcing consistent design and also for kind of taking care of a lot of the resizing problems for you. So they'll normally have a header, a main content section, a footer. And if it's not done here as it is with HTML, you might find that it's classes you have to apply. So getting into kind of the bootstrap domain. And then they'll probably have wrappers for different types of data. So you can see all the typography wrappers here, but you'll see things for icons, maybe particular font awesome icon libraries, icons, images, all those kinds of things. Now I said data was also going to impact. And the first thing that I've kind of seen quite common is relationships between particular entities. So for an example, it might be the moving of a particular product between accounts is a good example. Or from my own personal experience, and I actually had to do this week, is sending gift cards to family. I think we've been doing a lot of gift card swapsies on particular websites. So it's like, okay, I'm going to send you X for your birthday, and then it comes back the same amount afterwards. And we all end up getting in that panic of thinking, oh, how much did I send the last time? I really need to go and check. And anyway, the joys of social etiquette. But our data does have lots of relationship data, and it's definitely worth having a look to see how we can represent that. I've seen people try to do this in a grid, but it doesn't always quite work out depending on the types of relationships that you have. So here what you'll see is I've got a grid showing gift cards. So what you'll see if I scoot over here is you've got the person that sent the gift card, and it's all the recipients of each of the cards underneath. And this works fine if you want to figure out who Mr. Martian's been sending to. But if you want to see reflexive relationships and relative volumes, this is going to get a bit more tricky. So depending on what you want to do, there are a few different chart types. I am going to cover the chord diagram today, but anyone who's interested in showcasing relationships, you should also look up a Sankey diagram. So the chord diagram, you have the arcs on the outside, so that's the sections of the ring, and then you have the ribbons, which are the relationships between. I like to think of a Sankey as like ribbons that are going from left to right without being encased within the circle, but you can also have the ribbons connect to each other to show multi-level flows. And then anyone from a computer science or even a maths background is probably thinking about maybe topology courses or graphing courses where they've thought about nodes and connectors. That's a network diagram, so you can have a look at those as well. Now, normally, whenever we started trying to think about these advanced chart types here, this is where we started looking at D3GS. So anyone who's maybe heard of it, great. If you can use it, I would love to chat to you more about your experiences. But a lot of people are quite intimidated by it. So for those who haven't heard of it, D3GS is a basically SVG-focused library. You can draw absolutely amazing visualizations with it, but it does have a high learning overhead. And when we're building out enterprise apps, we need to think about that. It's all fine and well talking about the wonderful array of different courses that people can learn from, all the different tutorials and blogs that I've read over the years to try and get a bit more comfortable with D3. But when you're faced with building or maintaining products at work, you're probably not going to want to go for something like that. And I've actually been on the opposite side of this coin. So I had a colleague who built this absolutely fantastic flowchart. It was a work of art. It was wonderful. But all of the other engineers were terrified of maintaining it, of doing anything to it, and of doing any D3 upgrades. And that was a really sad thing because we were basically effectively scared of looking after something that was a very useful tool for users. And it probably meant that we weren't as advocating as much for this particular control in hindsight as we should have. So I've used Nivo here. You can use some high charts for some advanced chart types, or there's loads of other different libraries. But generally the patterns you're using for showcasing these kind of advanced chart types are pretty much the same. So the first thing that I'm going to talk to you about is the data, because that's structured in a slightly different way from what we've seen before in terms of just flat arrays. So what you'll see here is I've basically got a matrix. So my data is getting passed in here as the data. The keys here is basically my customer list. And then data is basically a matrix of my customer dimensions. So if we take a couple of examples, just to show you the reflexive element as well, you will see here that for Mr. Coyote, this is how much he's sending to himself. Now, why he's sending that much in gift cards, I don't know. But for the purposes of the data, that's what we've got. And then this will be, because this is the first line and then also the second element, so this is the amount that he's sending to runner. So that's kind of the array-based implementation that you have. Now, moving on. The particular point is now changing. So it's not just like a case of an individual data point of like an X and Y coordinate. We have ribbons, which means we have a source and we have a target. Show the relationship, and you can normally want to expose that to the user. So that's what we've done here in this particular tooltip. So you see the colors and you see the values that you're pulling off of the ribbons. And then finally, we don't eliminate all of the fancy stuff and all of the mathematical calculations for positioning things. These libraries often have particular defaults you need to think about. So thankfully, the Nivo documentation is actually really good and has some really nice examples, so I could pretty much not muck with them too much. But there's 3 particular values on a chord that you need to think about. So the first one here is your pad angle, and that's basically the gap between each of those arcs around the outside of the circle. Then you got your inner radius ratio, which is the proportion of the ribbons making up the total circle. And then you got your inner radius offset, which is the gap between that ribbon section in the middle, and then the arc sections on the outside. Okay, now the last type of data that I've seen quite difficult to cover in a grid is jurisdiction-based data, so where you've got locations. So I've seen this covered in a couple of ways. I've seen people just put the city in a column. Okay, fine, that's going to work. Unless you're talking about trying to discern between London, UK and then London, Ontario, as one of my close friends would probably point out. And I've seen people sometimes use flags on the inline as well to show that, but that doesn't always necessarily work. So usually you want to try and showcase it as a geographical representation, which again might be getting into D3 territory and might be a little bit scary. But they're good. I mean, it's effectively a bubble chart, if you think about it, with your axis being your latitude and longitude. And bubble charts are good because they can show relative volume. So you can see the different sizes of the circles and kind of quite quickly be able to identify particular, high volume areas of distribution, which might be a very important use case in e-commerce. So maps probably seem a little bit scary, but there's loads of wrappers that you can use. There is Leaflet.js, which is a wonderful JavaScript library. But for the purposes of this segment, I've actually used something called React Simple Maps. There's also the Google Maps stuff as well, if you want to have a look at that. But the key things that you want to think about with maps is firstly something called a projection. So projection in layman's terms from the research that I did is basically thinking, obviously, the Earth is a globe. We'll not get into the politics of that potentially. But your projection is where you translate that into a flat representation. You're going to need the polygon information. That's the next thing. So, of course, you will see it up here very, very small. I'm basically passing in a JSON representation of the world. Now, there's two formats that you will see when you start looking at this stuff. There's one called GeoJSON, and there's one called TopoJSON. And the difference between the two is that there's topographical information inside the TopoJSON one. If there's anyone who's a former geography major in the background, they might be able to explain, but that's my understanding what the deal is there. So then you're going to want to take that and actually render these, and that's what this geographies attribute is doing, which you can see in the middle. It's basically taking those and it's mapping them on. And then we want those bubbles. Now, you can sometimes have little icons and pins. We're all used to that from, using map apps on our phones. But in this case with the markers, I've just done simple SVG. So I've got a circle with the diameter related to the fulfilled purchase count to try and give a rough indicator of size. And then you've also got your two text elements as well to talk about the city and then also the value as well. Okay, so you're probably getting to this point and you're saying, Carly, I remember you saying that data grids weren't evil. And you've spent the whole time talking about visualizations. So when can I use a data grid, in your opinion? Well, this is the moment. This is the moment where I will share some tips on what I found works well for using grid-based implementations. So one use case I have came across, which is legitimate, is that sometimes you do have parts of an organization that need to deal with more flexible reporting requirements. So maybe they are a PR function talking to press. Maybe they are talking to regulators. Maybe they are talking to, sales teams or customers or something, and they do need the ability to generate their own types of reports. That is a legitimate case, but if you let them take the data outside of into spreadsheets, you don't necessarily get the insights of how they're using the data. You lose the ability to get feedback and user statistics, which we all like when we're trying to adapt our solutions. So in that instance, I recommend looking at a pivot capability and adding it into your app yourself. Now, I've shown this as AG Grid. I will warn you, it is an enterprise feature. You can have a look at Pivot Table.js and some others just to have a feel for what you look, but it really does depend on how complex the set of pivoting capability you want to give them. But once you give them that, you can do some pretty cool stuff. You can look at the usage and see these user statistics. But you can also do funky things like give them profiling capabilities so that they can share these amongst themselves, which is something that might be a bit easier than having to share that master spreadsheet around. And then the last thing to say is that it shouldn't ever be this one or the other. There are cases where it actually makes sense to have both. And you'll see that in the the animation that I've got running about here just now. So what's happening here is whenever we are clicking on a particular chart, so either the nibble chord or the high charts stacked bar chart, had to think about that there. Whenever you click on either of those positions, you will see that the underlying detail in the grid is actually updating. And this allows you to give high-level summaries and then allow them to dig into further information. So a good example would be, the status is here. Maybe they want to see within that particular segment what is shipped versus not shipped. And that might be a useful thing to allow them to do in a grid. So we'll walk through the rough mechanics based on this implementation, But obviously, depending on the types of grids and charts you'll probably do something slightly similar, albeit your precise logic and calls might be differing slightly. So the first thing to note is that you're going to have some form of callback event that is going to have to be triggered on the click of the particular point. Now, if it's a basic bar, it's just going to be a basic click event, and that's how it works in high charts, so that'll be fine. But with our particular chord chart, well, we've got two things we can click on. We've got an arc and we've got a ribbon. So you might want to handle those differently. In this case, I'm not, but you can. So you're going to have your callback function as the first thing that you need to worry about. Second thing that you're going to need to worry about is pulling out the precise information. And this is truly library dependent. So what you'll see here, if I wander over, is you have event.point is what we've got for high charts. And then depending on the NIVO, whether it is a chord diagram or a normal one, I can pull out a source or I can pull out an ID. And then depending on the framework you're using, you're going to want to pass this information somehow to the appropriate grid control. So this is a React example, as you might have seen through the flavors of all the examples I've done today. So I'm setting state and then passing it down as props into a shell component. But obviously, if we're getting into Angular land, you're probably going to want to look at event emitters or another approach. Just look at what's appropriate for the framework that you're using on the top. And then we can't leave the grid out, can we? You're going to have to call the native grid filtering API. Otherwise, you're going to end up having to start manipulating the data underneath. And why not just get the grid to do it for you? So in this particular instance, what you'll see at the top here is I am getting the filter instance. I'm then processing my products, and I'm setting the model to be a list of values. You're probably going to want to look about whether that particular filter is a multi-select or not, because quite often they are. And in that case, you're going to want to pass in a list. So just bear that in mind. And then finally, for your grid API, you're going to invoke the onFilter changed event so that it knows that the filter selection has changed and therefore you need to do something about it. So we have talked about a lot today. We have talked about my opinion on data grids and how they're overused. We've talked about the innocent reasons why this does in fact manifest in institutions where we have high volumes of data. And we've also talked about all those other lovely visualizations that you can use to showcase your data based on user behavior and data structure. And we've talked about when grids can be used as well, just to balance things out. But I'm hoping you'll have noticed there's probably a slight undertone to this talk. As hard as it can be, we're building products for users, and that means we need to be able to talk to them and understand the problems they're trying to solve in order to recommend the types of products and illustrations and visualizations and grids that we should use. So I do implore you to sometimes just sit and talk to your user. It's done me well for 10 years, and hopefully it will continue to do so. So I'm hoping that I've inspired you to maybe look at some visualizations, get playing with some new libraries today. So let me give you some further resources that you can try out. So the first book is called Data Sketches. It's by Nadia Bremer and Shirley Wu. And what happened is they took a theme, so like movies, the Olympics or something like that, and they each built a visualization, and they did this, I think, every month for a year. And the book documents from initial sketching and design all the way through to the implementation using the libraries they were using. You can also follow them on Twitter. They've got some other lovely courses and resources out there as well. But anything by those two, I definitely recommend having a look at. The second is Information is Beautiful by a guy called David McCandless. So he has his website where they have some stunning visualizations, but he's also got a series of books, and Information is Beautiful is the first one. So do have a check of that. D3 Graph Gallery is good, even if you're not using D3. There's loads of different ideas of how you can use these different chart types, particular extensions you can put on the top, and some really good descriptions on when to use one over the other. So I would definitely recommend that. But you can look at the wider world. Newspaper infographics and websites commonly have visualizations now. I was looking at one literally this morning on my way in. Any websites at all, obviously the code samples are there at the QR code if you want to go and have a look, and you can check them out and have a play with the visualizations as well. And yeah, thank you very much for listening, everybody. I'm hoping I've got you to think about visualizations and data grids today. We have a few minutes for questions, but otherwise I'll be around at the conference if anyone wants to come over and say hi. Thank you. Oh no. Sorry, familiar faces asked a question.
Hi. I just wanted to ask what your personal experience was implementing React within your presentation throughout that time.
Yeah, the secret's out, isn't it? So I am mainly from an Angular background. I have no idea if that shows. Certainly, that's one of the reasons why it's using the class-based components, if anyone had a look. But you know what? I actually quite right. I must admit, I've not seen as much of the war between the frameworks when I've had discussions with people, so I quite enjoyed it. And it obviously was a nice opportunity to learn. Probably not the best advice to try and learning a new framework for a talk. You know, it does add the pressure a little bit. But no, it was really fun. Thank you for asking. Got one? Oh, okay.
Okay, I'm just saying, if I understood you right, you said that data grids in many cases are not the right solution. So how do you know why, when they are not? In my project right now, there's a task list that people look at.
Uh-huh.
Here's who's got to do something, here's the state, here's some details.
Yes.
It seems that that data grid, the task list would be hard to replace with some sort of chart, because the chart just gives me some information. It doesn't
Yes.
tell me about the state of the task. So what's the guideline to say, hey, use a data grid because the information is valuable, or don't because people are just interested in summary?
Yes. That's a really good question. So since the mic is out, the question is around, and to make sure I confirmed it right, basically, you know, when is the right time to use a chart versus a grid? I think it's important to consider the audience. So obviously the story I shared at the start, we were finding out that, you know, we were building out these screens, but then the data was immediately coming out and then it was being transformed in different ways. If that is happening, it's most likely a case that you've kind of automated the detail portion, but the bit that's missing is the high level statistics. We kind of need to realize that there's different audiences for our data. Now, you know, a particular kind of senior leader or manager is not going to have the time to look at the really low level individual transactions, but an analyst might need that for additional information, or they might need to look at a subset for that. So in kind of the situations you're talking about where they need the detail, that's where that kind of last example where we talked about the two charts and then the grid underneath is really useful. It's absolutely fine to give them the data, but it's worth thinking about, do they need all of it immediately? And in most cases, I've found that it's not the case. So consider your audience would be the first tip, and then also consider the timing. Do they need it immediately? In which case, okay, fine, let's have a conversation about it. Or are they actually going to want to have a look at summary and kind of look at subsets of it first? In which case, use some charts first, and then you can dig into the detail in a grid later. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions? No? Yes?
When you have like high volumes, like say you have like a grid which has like 4,000 users in it.
Yes.
Is there any way to visualize that and then dig in the next map within the grid? Or is it sort of the grid and then you have to dig in and then you would get your nice visualization summaries for, I guess, that smaller subset of data?
Yeah, so the question is for like high volumes like that, is there any way to show all 4,000 in a chart? It does depend on what kind of metrics you're wanting to get out of it and showcase. So it could be a complex case. It might be that you have buckets for those particular users that you could visualize the counts of. So for example, if you have, you know, an e-commerce app that has particular products and you want to, you know, check if stuff is delivered versus shipped, etc., you can probably use bar charts to do that. And then maybe there's a particular one that's your problem area, and then that one you can drill into. Now, some chart libraries do have this idea of a drill down where you have a chart within a chart, which is quite funky. But in those instances, it might not, for the volumes you're talking about, be suitable. In that instance, it might be summarising the buckets first on the chart, and then obviously, have the data that they go into underneath in the grid. Another option you could think about is it might make sense. So if you have a distribution that you want to look at for these particular users or products or whatever it is, things like scatter plots are probably a useful thing. Now, obviously, the higher volume consideration you have, you're going to have to start looking at performance testing of the libraries to see. There are some kind of higher volume ones. So HighCharts does have some extensions for like high stocks and things that you can maybe look at. But obviously that would be the two things I would ask you to think about. But if you want to chat more about a particular use case in more detail and don't want to give all the detail just now, come and find me afterwards and we can chat, okay? Yes?
You mentioned the number of libraries for charts.
Yes.
If you were to choose one for your next Angular project, do you have a personal preference or maybe some tips regarding what not to use?
I will be careful here. No, so it's worth looking at the framework. So for example, Elastic do have their own UI library, but it's for React, so I would not suggest using that if you're an Angular shop. HighCharts is one that I've used very successfully. It has some really good free options, so you can definitely have a look at that. I know that I used it while I was in the bank as well, so a lot of maybe the licensing considerations, depending on your domain, obviously it's probably a pretty safe bet to try. And there is free and enterprise licenses that you can have a look at as well. And generally, a lot of myself and my colleagues that have used it have always found it very, very intuitive, easy to use, quickly to get up and running, and generally good support for Angular versions as well. So take a look at HighCharts. Cool. Time is up, but if anyone does have any other questions, do catch me floating about the conference. I'm in a green jacket, so you won't be able to miss me. Thank you very much.